has a reputation of a knockoff nation. From discs to devices, China makes all of them, even today. But something has changed in the last 2 decades. Chinese tech companies are challenging the Silicon Valley, catching up in tech innovation. Since 2011, China has filed more patents alone than all Western tech giants combined. And yet there's something fundamentally different about Chinese technology companies. They help the Chinese state snoop on its citizens, enable Beijing to run the largest surveillance system on this planet. And now China wants to use the same industry to emerge as a global technology leader by 2050. Is China fueling its superpower dreams through technology? That's what we'll discuss in this session. And with me is a very special panel of guests from Washington, D.C., Paul Triolo. He heads the geotechnology practice at the Eurasia Group. He tracks China's rise as a science, technology and cyber power. He's written extensively on the subject for leading international publications. Our second guest joins us from Adelaide in Australia, Simon Lacey. He served as Vice President, Global Government Affairs, Trade Facilitation and Market Access at Huawei Technologies. Presently, he's a senior lecturer of international trade with the University of Adelaide. And our final guest is General Robert Spalding, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. General Spalding has served as the Senior Director Strategy for the U.S. National Security Council. He joins us from Virginia in the U.S. Welcome to all of you on WION.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul Triolo, let me begin with you. In October last year, you wrote, and I'm quoting here, "China is not a technology superpower. Stop treating it like one." Why did you say that?
Well, it's a good question. I think that there's a perception out there that that's a little bit overblown about China's technology capabilities. So, in part, this is because of a lot of the national programs that China has promulgated, things like the Made in China 2025, of course, which the U.S. has reacted to as part of the trade talks, and things like Belt and Road, and national plans around artificial intelligence and things like quantum computing. So the Chinese are very good at putting out plans, national plans. But the reality on the ground in the commercial sector, where, of course, this is all being played out, is much different. So, for example, if you look at China in 2 critical areas, semiconductors and enterprise software, just two pretty important areas. There are virtually no Chinese companies, for example, in the top 10 in enterprise software. On the semiconductor side, while you do have companies like Huawei and its chip design arm HiSilicon that are very competitive globally and designing chips at the level of Qualcomm and other U.S. companies, those are all those chips are fabricated actually in Taiwan. So China's domestic capability, for example, in semiconductors is several generations behind Western leaders. And then if you look at semiconductor manufacturing equipment, for example, which is critical, China is nowhere on the map in terms of competing globally. So I think it depends on which sector you're looking at. Certainly China has competitive companies in things like e-commerce with Alibaba, in social media, of course, with Tencent and TikTok, which is a very controversial company lately. But I think that if you look at the broader picture, China is less than meets the eye, depending on which sector you look at.
Right. Simon Lacey, China has an alternative to every popular service on the internet. I have a list. For Google, they have Baidu. For WhatsApp, there's WeChat. For YouTube, there's Youku. TikTok's owner, ByteDance, made a separate app for China. It's called WION. Is China trying to become a tech superpower just by imitating?
Right. Look, I think imitation is the ultimate form of flattery, and I think that's certainly true in the case of China. We've seen some imitation in the early years, but if you look at, just to take one of those examples, WeChat, WeChat, I guess, first started out by imitating ICQ through the original, the forerunner of WeChat, which was QQ, and then developed a whole range of sort of separate functionality that went beyond chat. So I think they started out imitating and in many ways perfected those technologies and even improved upon them. But I mean, the point that Paul Triolo made just now is very important in the sense that Chinese technology companies have done very well in China for a whole range of reasons. But when they've tried to expand abroad, with very few exceptions, and Huawei was one of them, but when they've tried to expand abroad into international markets, they haven't managed to capture the same sort of momentum and the same sort of enthusiasm that they have at home. And WeChat is an example of that. And Paul Triolo mentioned Alibaba. Alibaba is very competitive in China, but it's been losing money hand over fist in Europe and other markets because it just hasn't been able to get the same sort of momentum.
General Spalding, your thoughts on this? How does China compare with the technology giants the world over? And would you call China a technology superpower, given all that the previous two speakers have spoken about? Big tech, does it threaten only the Silicon Valley from China, or does it pose a challenge for the rest of the world too?
Well, what you have to go back to and realize is that the way that the United States established dominance in the current information economy was the introduction of the smartphone as a computing platform. In 2007, when the iPhone came out, AT&T, General Electric, ExxonMobil, Shell, and Microsoft were the top 5 in market cap in the United States. In the course of 10 years, with the introduction of 4G networks, the combination of the smartphone and 4G changed that dynamic completely. Now, the FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google represent 15% of the S&P index today. So it's so dominant that it really has shifted, it's tilted the world economy. What the Chinese saw was they could do the same thing for 5G. So instead of trying to fight directly against the FANGs, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, what they're building in China is the second wave, and that is 5G. The computing platform migrates from the smart device to the network itself. So Huawei is determined to be the platform of the future. When you combine the platform with the data analytics that Silicon Valley built and then Chinese communists appropriated, then you have the combined model to really drive the system in a new direction, and that's what they hope to do. If you read Engineering Global Consent put out by Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the collection of this data, the aggregation of this data that drives artificial intelligence really flows to the Chinese Communist Party propaganda arm and the People's Liberation Army intelligence arm. What China is trying to do, if you listen to Kai-Fu Lee, is to become the Saudi Arabia of data. That's so they can be dominant in artificial intelligence. It's about 5G, it's about artificial intelligence, it's about autonomy, it's about tracking people the world over and using that data for influence and control.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the word control. Paul Triolo, according to a Harvard study, in 2002 itself, China was blocking at least 18,000 websites. By 2013, Beijing had employed more than 2 million people to monitor web activity. And one estimate says that China has more than 170 million surveillance cameras in 2016. Is China's technology then, more than anything else, meant as a weapon in the hands of the state to control its people?
No, I don't think so. I think you have to differentiate what's going on here. I mean, clearly the regime in Beijing has always been very concerned about content, about controlling information, controlling the news. And of course, it's not surprising that they would employ legions of censors to control the content as it moves to digital media. But I think, again, we have to differentiate here between sort of the state and its use of technology and the growing private sector in China. I mean, one thing that's very different now than say 20 years ago is that there is a private sector in China, and those companies, for example, are competing globally, and so they represent actually the sort of most progressive and sort of capitalist part of the Chinese system. And for those companies to succeed globally, like Alibaba that was mentioned, they're going to have to be differentiated from the Chinese state and its activities such as censorship. And so, the companies that have been successful, like Huawei, they're competing at the cutting edge in 5G, as the general mentioned. But that's because they're very market driven. They're competing in a very market driven sector that has some advantages because China's market is so huge. They can compete very, very effectively on price. But the companies that are driving China's tech revolution are very much in the private sector. They're not state owned, and they don't necessarily share all of the goals of the government here. And we've seen this already when those companies operate in places like Europe. They're running up against, data regimes, for example, that do stress things like privacy, and they're going to have a tough time if they can't differentiate themselves from the government and from things like censorship and surveillance.
That's an interesting point. They may not share the goals of the state, but they have to share information with the state. That's something that the law mandates them to do. General Spalding, do you agree with that? This is not about countries anymore. Earlier this year, the FBI chief had claimed that China's theft of technology is the biggest law enforcement threat to the United States. Now, you've been part of America's National Security Council. What was the nature of these threats?
Well, look, I would just have people read the Section 301 investigation that the U.S. Trade Representative put out. It describes all of these things that the Chinese Communist Party does in detail. It's important to note that China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, has two constitutions, the PRC Constitution and the Chinese Communist Party Constitution. And the sovereign of the nation is the Chinese Communist Party. They control the police, they control the borders, they control the military, they control the banks, they control the information superhighway, they control everything in China. So this fallacy of a separation between the government and private sector is exactly that, a fallacy. And in fact, Chinese private companies are not private at all. The Chinese Communist Party controls them. Importantly, if you look at the report that I mentioned, Engineering Global Consent, Global Tone Communication Corporation was widely boasting on its website that not only was it using the 2 to 3 petabytes of data it collected a year internationally for language translation, it was also directly shipping that data to the Chinese Communist Party propaganda arm and the PLA intelligence arm. There's no separation between these companies and the state. That is the way the Chinese Communist Party rules over China.
I'd like Simon Lacey to respond to this. Also, the fact that India recently banned 59 Chinese applications over national security concerns recently. Huawei may well be next. Many countries have already banned Huawei. Now, you've sat across government representatives, Simon Lacey, and negotiated market access for a company like Huawei. Can a Chinese company really be trusted if, as I said earlier, the law mandates it to share information with Beijing?
Yeah, look, I think that you need to remember that a lot of countries have laws on their statute books that require cooperation with law enforcement, with anti-terrorism efforts, and Huawei sort of really bent over backwards to try and put some distance between itself and the national security law, which was really unfortunately formulated for the Chinese tech industry, when other countries have those powers and don't really feel the need to broadcast them so transparently or openly as the Chinese government did in the 2017 national security law. But I think sitting across from governments, I think that the real problem was that Huawei had is that it had a long history of cooperation with operators. And it had proven to operators, who are the ones who know their networks best and who understand the cybersecurity concerns best, it had proven that it was a reliable partner. And it was willing and able to defend its reputation and to defend itself and its track record on that basis. But when it was asked to defend itself on nebulous concepts such as geopolitical risk, then of course it was unable to do so, and so because many companies would be unable to defend themselves on that basis, and so I think that was the real problem that Huawei faced, and that Huawei continues to face now in markets like the UK. I mean, you have to remember, in the UK there was a very evidence-based, very transparent, very objective telecom infrastructure review last year that came to the conclusion, that interviewed hundreds of experts and came to the conclusion that security wasn't about banning one vendor, but it was about network resilience and accommodating all kinds of risks. And so the decision was taken on the basis of that review that even though there was risk, Huawei could be admitted to the network. And then that decision has been thrown overboard due to a concoction of various things, including political pressure, I think, from the US, but also domestic party politics, conservative party politics in the UK.
You make a good case for Huawei. well, you make it sound like Huawei is the victim here. Paul Triolo, never before have we seen a political and diplomatic fight over deals to install mobile phone towers. Why are governments and leaders around the world so keen on dictating the terms, especially for 5G?
Well, it's a good question, and it's because 5G is a sort of a game changer. I think the general alluded to this earlier. The data and capabilities and the capacity and the speeds and the latency of 5G and its broad use, for example, for things like critical infrastructure, means that 5G compared to 4G and 3G is going to be carrying a lot more sensitive data, a lot more personal data, a lot more critical infrastructure data. And so suddenly 5G has become more of a political issue. I did a white paper in 2018 called The Geopolitics of 5G, where I laid out some of the issues around the whole 5G debate, things like standards, and of course emphasized that China, for example, does have a very, very broad and major strategy on 5G, because I agree with the general that 5G is really going to be a game changer, and Chinese companies again have decided that they want to be leaders here, and so in the last 2 years, the U.S. has, in part because the U.S. doesn't have a 5G strategy or a very coherent one. There's concern in the U.S. not just within government but in the business community that the U.S. is lagging behind in 5G, and that China, by rolling out rapidly, which they're doing right now, a broad national 5G network that's going to include full standalone 5G, for example, that will enable things like autonomous vehicles, that China's going to gain a critical lead in innovation on top of 5G. Because remember, the real promise of 5G are those innovative applications that will be run on top of it. And so the U.S. is, in part of the pushback, I think, on Huawei is a desire to slow China's potential dominance in 5G.
I do want to agree with you, but over the past 6 months, I've made a long list of questions that begin with, why would Beijing do this? Having said that, General Spalding, I want you to respond to these points of view. Do you believe that Huawei is a victim rather than party to the perpetrator? And is America just using this technology threat or security threat as a ruse because America doesn't have an alternative to Huawei?
Well, so first of all, this idea that the Huawei can fight off the Chinese Communist Party, 8 million people in Hong Kong couldn't fight off the Chinese Communist Party. They've essentially put their boot on the throat of the people of Hong Kong without even blinking an eye. And that's a huge threat to the Chinese economy because Hong Kong is a window to Western capital markets. So let's discard this argument that, any company in China can fight off the Chinese Communist Party. Not going to happen. More importantly, I think we need to understand that, in many ways, America is a victim of its own success. Silicon Valley built these enormous companies. Nobody can argue with the influence that Facebook and Google has on the global economy. I think everybody would agree on that. What they built was a capacity over an open data model to aggregate and then harvest data and then monetize it, monetize user data. This is incredibly valuable for getting you to buy shoes. But what the Chinese Communist Party figured out, not only could they get you to buy shoes, Alibaba made $38 billion last year on 11/11 on Singles Day, just in one day. So they understand that. But what they found is not only can they influence you to buy shoes, they can influence you to make political choices. They can influence the way your outlook is of the world. And that's what they're doing in China, and that's what they seek to do in the rest of the world. It is about the dominance of Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. It's really not about Huawei. Why does Facebook, why does Amazon, why does Google all have AI research centers in China? It's because of the lax data rules that they have there. They understand that the way to have AI dominance is to have access to data, and the only place to do it is behind the Great Firewall. So the Chinese Communist Party allows these tech companies to harvest data, to build their algorithms in anticipation of dominating the 5G market. What will 5G allow you to do? It will allow you to track every movement of every citizen in every major city around the world.
Right. Simon Lacey, now that you've left Huawei, maybe you can throw some light on what was the thinking in the system. Was there a worry that the links with the Communist Party and perhaps the PLA will at some point be under scrutiny because 5G is, all said and done, a very, very sensitive technology?
Look, I remember having conversations with colleagues about this, a couple of years before the rollout of 5G and all the geopolitical tensions started. And I think there was some kind of, I think the company sort of deluded itself into thinking that as long as it was the leader in 5G and its technology was so far ahead of its competitors and was indispensable as a company, its technology would be accepted. And it didn't realize that it was going to be way behind in terms of a lot of people are really destabilized and disconcerted by China because it's come so fast, and they just don't understand it that well. And the Chinese, to be frank, they're not really that good at communicating communicating their values and debating things, because there's no open or free debate in China. And so when it came time to defend themselves on anything but technical specifications, they really fell down, and so I think that was a real shock for the company, and they didn't anticipate. I think they anticipated that there would be some level of mistrust, and so they did go through the trouble of building these cybersecurity evaluation centers, which would prove from a technical level that they were as safe as could be expected in the industry to industry standards. But I don't think they really anticipated that they would have to defend themselves on things like geopolitical risk. In a sense, I don't really understand why America is so nervous about China. I mean, like the general, I lived in China and I've also lived in America, and I just find that America has a much more compelling vision and message and narrative to the world that inspires people much more than this Leninist Marxist doctrine that's being perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think America is so far ahead militarily that they really, and also technologically and on so many levels, that they really don't have that much to fear. In fact, I think they should welcome the rise of China, because America has always achieved its greatest accomplishments when it had a great power rival. I mean, think of the space race that was kicked off by Sputnik. So having a rival like China will really drive America. It will shake America out of its complacency and drive America to achieve the greatness that it achieved after the Second World War. And I think America's greatest days are still ahead of it.
General Spalding, is America nervous?
Well, I don't think America's nervous. I think what we're trying to do is come to grips with the fact that national security is very different in the 21st century. We have this incredible Air Force and Navy and Army and Marine Corps, when we can, protect America and our allies in the space, in the air, in the land, in the sea. The problem is, in the 21st century, national security is much more about ones and zeros and dollars and cents than bombs and bullets. And what the Chinese Communist Party figured out is it was very easy to bypass all of those and go directly to citizens. So when you see the rise of a social media platform like TikTok, if you see the power of the spread of WeChat and things like Alipay, all of these things come together to slowly grow the power in this digital sense. And so what the Western world didn't realize, and really kind of abdicated their responsibility in protecting user data and security and privacy of their citizens. Now, the EU passed GDPR in their hope that they would get companies to comply. The truth of the matter is they can't enforce GDPR because we did not build our networks such that we could physically control the access to their citizens' data. So they try to fine them. Well, how easy is it to fine a Chinese company? It's literally impossible, because they refuse to pay the fine, and the Chinese Communist Party backs them up. So the truth of the matter is that if you're looking at data privacy and data security and individual rights, that is not the world that Silicon Valley built. And the Chinese Communist Party realized that. That's why they built the Great Firewall, to protect their own people from the social media and other e-commerce platforms from the West, to build a dominance behind that Great Firewall, and then to begin to export it through things like the digital Silk Road. So there's fiber throughout Eurasia that's designed to help build these networks that China seeks to deploy, and then slowly, dominate the e-commerce that goes forward into the future. So they're going to be influencing not just the purchase habits of people, also the political orientation of people that are essentially have access to. It used to be that you had to conquer a nation and a people in order to subjugate them. Now through the internet, you can begin to motivate them in different ways.
General Spalding, all technology, for that matter, is a double-edged sword. The revelations by Edward Snowden reveal how the US intelligence, for instance, had developed sophisticated tools to snoop on individuals on the internet. What is the bigger threat then? Is China being unfairly targeted, or are all companies that have access to data, that have access to people, are potential threats then?
Well, if you look at the competition today, it's really settling into a bipolar world. You have China that has the interest, the Chinese Communist Party, to stay in power. You have the United States, who's promoting democratic principles, rule of law, civil liberties, human rights, free trade, all of these things that the international order was built on. The interesting thing that we looked at in the White House is that in spite of the fact that we had built this order and successfully, enabled many of the rise of countries around the world, to include China, what we found was, instead of promoting those principles and values in international institutions, we were seeing the rise of authoritarianism. Why were we seeing that? Well, what happened was Deng Xiaoping had a key insight and made a key innovation to their authoritarian system. What he said is, we're going to allow people to get rich. And so what the Chinese Communist Party has built is a unique engine. And what they do is use the resources of the state, primarily capital, the banks, and the intelligence collection arm, to pick winners and losers. And they do that by offering incentives to those companies that end up doing well. This is how Alibaba did well. They had access to more capital. They had access to more technology. The same for Huawei. But not only were they successful incentivizing their own companies, they incentivized, in the United States, corporate America and Wall Street. So many of these tech companies in the United States saw that if they participated in the proper way with China, if they cooperated with the Chinese Communist Party, then they would have access to the market. So there is no way that social media is going to be opened up in China ever, as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in charge. In terms of opening up their borders for trade, they tore up 50 pages of the trade deal that Ambassador Lighthizer and Liu He negotiated. They have no instance in market reform, no interest in market reform. And in fact, what they've done is essentially turn the global business community, corporate America, Wall Street in the United States, onto their side, because they are incentivized, or essentially make profits, because they promote the Chinese Communist Party vision of one world economy. The challenge for that one world economy is, again, it doesn't promote democratic principles, free trade, human rights, civil liberties, or rule of law.
Simon Lacey, would Chinese tech companies submit themselves to a global regulatory mechanism and follow global standards before they're allowed to do business in countries where they face restrictions?
Yeah, I think they would, and I think you saw that at Huawei. I mean, speaking from my personal experience, I mean, when the GDPR came out, every Huawei employee had to pass a test annually to show that they understood what the GDPR meant and how to comply with it. And what the GDPR did was simplify things in a way that there was one standard that you had to comply with. Now, it was a high standard, but once you complied with that standard, you were complying, because it was a high standard, you were complying with pretty much every standard everywhere, right? So I think business is very much against this sort of system fragmentation that we're seeing, because it raises costs and it also ultimately leads to less innovation. Look, I think Paul Triolo said something very interesting, and the general alluded to this when he said, the Chinese state built this massive firewall and protected their companies behind it. And if you remember back to 2009. When Twitter and Facebook were banned, and then about a year later when Google sort of decided to shut shut up shop, at least in terms of search in China. You had this kind of lack of reciprocal market access, and that's really what we need to negotiate with the Chinese on is reciprocity. And I would say this to officials when I walked into the European Commission and had the conversation with them. I said, you have to insist on reciprocity, and not some vague notion of reciprocity in terms of global market value or global market access. But with China, it has to be apples to apples, and that's something that's going to be really difficult for the Chinese leadership. But once you make it clear that that's the only way that their tech companies are going to enjoy the same market access in the West that the rest of their companies do, then they'll come to the negotiating table. So reciprocity is really the key thing here, and I think reciprocity is something that as human beings we instinctively understand because it's hardwired into our DNA because it sort of corresponds to notions of fairness and things like that.
Reciprocity would be welcome, but then I think we're having this conversation 6 months too late because companies and countries have taken their positions. Paul Triolo, Chinese tech companies are facing bans and there are boycott calls for Chinese apps. Is the internet, post this pandemic, now rapidly developing borders?
It already had borders in part because of those things that Simon mentioned and the general mentioned, this lack of reciprocity. So at the highest level, the social media and search have already been bifurcated, if you will, for some time. I think the challenge is in these other areas of the technology stack, right? I mean, are we going to have two different 5G networks that are not interoperable? We may be headed in that direction. At the semiconductor level, is China going to go in one direction and the U.S. in another? I think one of the problems that nobody mentions is that to some degree the success, for example, of leading U.S. companies, semiconductor companies, is derived in part from their access to the China market and their ability to plow R&D money based on their sales in China back into their U.S. operations and innovate for the U.S. And actually the semiconductor industry makes this argument as a national security argument because having access to the China market is critical to them. Having access to the Chinese market doesn't mean they're supporting the goals of the Chinese Communist Party, but it means they're working with innovative Chinese companies and designing semiconductors that then are used globally and become part of their global operations. So I think we have to be careful because for 40 years we've had very tightly coupled technology sectors, and China has been a big part of that. And the Chinese market is huge, and so you can't sort of just neglect the fact that there's benefits for having U.S. companies and European companies have access to that market. If we're going to be in this world where it's too sensitive politically for Western companies to play in the China market, then we're looking at a much more serious split in the technology world beyond just social media companies and search engines. And I think we're headed in that direction.
Jen Spalding, before I wrap, I have to ask you this. Will diplomatic alliances now dictate which smartphone I get to use?
Well, you probably should think differently about the future than in smartphones. The 5G network's really going to replace a smartphone in terms of your interaction with the internet. It's going to allow you to, essentially separate yourself from the smartphone rather than touching an app on your phone to call an Uber. You'll just be able to walk out and a camera will use facial recognition on your face and you'll say Uber and a car will be sent. That's the power of 5G, and that's what's coming. I would say in response to this technological bifurcation, that's really the trap that we've set for ourselves. Yes, we control semiconductors, but by and large, Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, Cisco, Juniper, AT&T, Verizon, all go to 3GPP, which is the industry standard making body for 5G, and cooperate with what is primarily a Chinese designed network. So 5G today is Chinese designed. 60%, over 60% of the security standards have been submitted by China. Most of the underlying patents for that has been submitted by Chinese companies. This 5G, for the most part, is a Chinese network that we're building, that we're commonly building with U.S. tech companies. And so we should be very, very worried about the state of future technology and the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to track what we're doing and then use it to turn around and influence not only our consumption patterns, but the politics that we believe in.
Right. Interesting times is all I can say. Paul Triolo, Simon Lacey, General Robert Spalding, thank you very much for being with us here on WION.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.